can run and get you some water if you need. Do you want any water? I can get one for you, and I'll sneak it up here. That is not a problem. Good evening, everyone. How is everyone? There is a lot of rowdy people on that side. It's okay. I'll forgive you. I just want to remind everybody to silence their cell phone before we get started. Tonight, we'll be learning about Leading Women of Virginia, Part 2. In the spring, the Valentine Museum shared details about landmark female figures in our region from pre-colonial to Civil War era. Now we'll learn of Richmond's female leaders from Civil War to the present. All right, take it away.
Good evening. How are you? Well, it's good to be here. We were just talking, let's see, I started coming to Covenant Woods about 10 years ago when I first went with the Valentine. And that was before some of the additions and so forth. And there's a little small recreation room we would do it in over there. This is a really nice facility here for tonight. Again, I'm Dwayne Miller with the Valentine. Now, a lot of you are familiar with the Valentine. Let's see. Did you work there? No, you worked at Virginia Museum. Okay. Is somebody here who worked? You were at the Valentine, aren't you? Okay, I thought so. Okay, good. Well, it's good to have somebody from the Valentine. Now, I heard a couple of you talking about the Valentine, and you were talking about how you love to go over there and so forth. Raise your hand if you've been there. Almost everybody's been there, yeah. It's been around forever, and I'm not going to go into too much detail because, in past presentations we've talked about the Valentine and how long it's been around and, Man Valentine being involved in all of that. What we're going to do is go ahead and get in. I will touch on this, though. The Valentine has always been dedicated to history as it plays out in the Richmond area. We've got museums that cover all kinds of things. You can go up to the Smithsonian or to National Galleries or all kinds of places. But the Valentine, as I say, focuses on people, places in the Richmond area and how that played out in history. Do I need to get back a little bit? So they can see you. Yep. I was trying to hide from them. I kidded with her earlier about some spotlights and singing, but I'm not going to sing. So what we're going to talk about tonight then, along that line of people in the Richmond area, is we will be talking about the more modern era of the leading women of Richmond, the roles they played, the sacrifices they made, the things they did to help, improve the lot of people in and around the city of Richmond. Did many of you hear the first presentation, Leading Women Part 1? Okay. Some of you did. Well, good. Okay, I'm going to kind of skip through some of these. These are some images from the Valentine. Let me go back to one here. What's that right there? If you can see it. It's close. Millen Road's clock, yeah, that's at the Valentine. Here's one example. I'll just use that as one example of the way that the Valentine has been a part of Richmond's history. You're familiar with Tallheimers and Millen Roads, and you grew up going to those department stores, and it was such a shock and such a tragedy for the Richmond area when they closed down late 1980s, early 1990s. And a lot of the items in Millen Roads were going to be auctioned off or sold. Somebody from out of state was interested in coming in and buying a clock, Millen Roads. Well, a lot of the people who were former employees of Mill and Rhodes Department Store did not really like the idea of somebody coming in from out of state like that, purchasing that clock and taking it to who knows where. So the employees got together and raised, I think it was about $12,000. They purchased that clock from, closing Mill and Rhodes. It was donated to the Valentine, and that's why it's there now. Now, if I'll pick on Target a minute. If Target were to close tomorrow, I wonder how many of the employees would pitch in to buy one of those great big red balls, to donate to the Valentine Museum. Okay. So, Leading Women of Richmond, Part 2. Let's get started on that. We're going to pick up with a number of women who were born maybe just before the Civil War, during the Civil War, just after the Civil War, or later in the program, some, born in the 20th century. But a lot of these ladies who were born, say, in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870, right around there, they grew up in what was known as the Progressive Era, not only in Richmond, the Progressive Era in this nation's history. A period, late 1800s up until about 1920 or so. And it was a period of time in which the industrialization of the country and around the world was taking place. Theodore Roosevelt, when he was president and leading up to being president, was very interested in trying to address some of those problems that came up because of industry and because of difficult working conditions, long hours, child labor, women in factories and positions where sometimes they were getting hurt, large powers of these corporations. So all of these things were being addressed during the Progressive Era. Can y'all still see me? Okay. And these ladies that we're going to talk about, to a great extent, wanted to become involved in how they could, in their little niche, wherever they might be, whether it's in art, whether it's in politics, whatever it might be, how they could help things. So let's take a look at a couple of them. We're going to start with somebody in the medical field, Dr. Sarah Garland Jones. You can see she was born a year after the end of the Civil War. She was born in Albemarle County in 1866. A few years later, late 1860s, her family moved to Richmond. Her father was a very well-respected builder. One example, 6th Street Zion Baptist Church in Jackson Ward. He was the builder of that. She attended school at the school that later became Armstrong High School in Richmond. And she taught for a few years after she finished her education there, but then she wanted to do more. She went up to Howard University, first African-American female to be in the medical program there at Howard University, earned her degree, came back to Richmond, and took her medical board examination. There were 86 people that took that examination that year. And I think it was in like surgery and hygiene and practice. Guess who got the highest score on those examination tests for the board? Dr. Jones did. So she became first African-American doctor in Virginia in the late 1800s. In Richmond, she established a practice in Jackson Ward. Her concern was the mortality rate among the African American community in the city of Richmond was twice that of the white community. So she established free daily clinics, medical clinics, at which individuals could come and receive free medical care to address that problem she was so concerned with. She and her husband, who was also a physician, established the Richmond Hospital Association in Jackson Ward. It had a number of African-American doctors, nurses, staff, and that kind of thing. Its successor years later down the road, was Bond Secure Richmond Community Hospital up on Church Hill, which is there. So very instrumental in the development of the medical profession among African American folks in the Richmond area. Just a tremendous contribution to, she just well recognized, in her time, despite the fact that during this time, obviously there was a lot of discrimination that was taking place at the same time, but her efforts were recognized. Let's see. There we go. All of you know Maggie Walker, I'm sure. Maggie Walker's mother was an assistant cook over at the Van Loo home up on Church Hill, before, during, after the Civil War. And her mother's husband was killed, or died in, I think it was like 1876. And so even though Maggie Walker's mother was still in that position as an assistant cook there, she needed to make, more money. So she began a laundry business out of her home. And what would happen was young Maggie, as a 12-year-old or so, would go to folks' homes, get their clothing, take it back. It would be, washed, dried, ironed, folded, that kind of thing, and taken back. And they were doing this for a number of families in the white community. The reason I go into that detail is because Maggie Walker, as a young girl, was then able to see, by that experience, she was able to see that there was a huge difference in the standard of living among those more well-to-do white families that they were getting the clothes from for laundry, and in the African-American community. So Maggie Walker received some education through this school, later became part of Armstrong. And she was actually she was a classmate of Dr. Jones that we just saw a moment ago. While she was in high school, she became a member of the Order of St. Luke's. Now, that's an African-American fraternal organization that was concerned with the social and economic well-being of the African-American community. And then after she finished school, she continued her association with that organization, later moved on up the ladder to become the top position in there, which was the general secretary. At the time that Maggie Walker became general secretary of the Order of St. Luke, they had like 1,000 members, and they had $31 in the bank. She increased, and this was, not just a Richmond or a Virginia, it was a, multi-state organization. She increased the membership to over 100,000. And there were three things that she did. Number one, she established a bank. And two, she established a newspaper for the community. And three, she established an emporium, which is like a dry goods store. It was on the north side of Broad Street, and it was to be a place where the African-American community could shop when they were not always welcome, say, at our Tallheimers and Millen Roads that we talked about a little bit earlier. This bank that she helped charter, the St. Luke's Penny Savings Bank, her goal, and kind of thinking back to her early experience, to see that there needed to be a means, a way that the African-American community could rise in their economic development, able to borrow money for purchase of a home or for a business or that type of thing. Now, this bank was established, but then the Depression hit. And when the Depression hit in the city of Richmond, a number of banks failed. A number of well-established banks down on Main Street failed, went completely under. Maggie Walker approached two other African-American banks in the Richmond area, and they consolidated. And it became, I just gave you the clue, what was the name of the bank it became? Consolidated Bank and Trust. Now, Consolidated Bank and Trust was able to weather the Depression. They got through it by unifying that way. That speaks, I think, fairly highly of her financial skills. So first African American chartered bank in the country was this St. Luke's Penny Savings Bank. That bank remained around until 2009. It was acquired by Premier Bank. Now, this is an interior picture of that emporium that I mentioned that was on the north side of Broad, a small dry goods store. It was begun in the early 1900s, didn't really survive that long, just didn't get enough traffic and trade as they had hoped it would get. And then that's a notice from that St. Luke's Penny Savings Bank. If you're driving up 95, headed north, and come through the city of Richmond, on the right-hand side of 95, which split Jackson Ward, you can still see this building there that housed that bank. This is a picture of the interior. Here are some young people who are being encouraged to establish good financial habits, such as saving money, opening a savings account, investing money, that kind of thing. Maggie Walker lived on Lee Street, I think it was 110 and a half Lee Street, during most of her time that she was operating that bank and so forth. It's that home that she was in is now on the National Historic Registry. In 2017, just a couple of years ago, right at the corners of Adams and Broad, the statue for Maggie Walker was unveiled and is there to commemorate her, and the location, of course, is significant too, right in the area that she was so instrumental in helping develop. All right, let's see. We've talked about Dr. Jones in the medical field and Maggie Walker in the financial field. Let's talk about Virginia Randolph Ellett, who would be in the educational field. She came to Richmond very early. Her mother was very interested in education and in education of women, which was not something that was a big part of the scene, the cultural scene and the educational scene in the late 1800s. So Virginia Randolph Ellett received some education in the North, came back. She and her mother started a school for girls, and their first location was on Grace Street, 100 block of Grace Street. And they were there until 1897, and then they moved it over to just across the alley over to Franklin in Linden Row, which is right across the street from where the present Richmond City Library is. Now, at the time, women's education primarily consisted in preparing them for motherhood and running the home, running a household. Miss Ellett wanted no parts of that. She was interested in things like English history and mythology, classical studies, classical languages. Foreign language was a part of her curriculum. She developed a curriculum that was so stringent and so demanding of the young ladies who were coming through her school that Bryn Mawr College outside of Philadelphia recognized it as a source of young ladies who would be properly trained for the rigors of a collegiate education at Bryn Mawr. So this school that Miss Ellett began, she and her mother began, started having examinations in the city of Richmond for their students and any other, female students who wanted to try to get into Bryn Mawr. So this was one of 8 cities only in the country that was providing that avenue for young ladies. This is a picture taken on the campus of St. Catherine's School out on Grove Avenue. So guess who started St. Catherine's School? It was Virginia Randolph Ellett. She started that in, I think it was 1917, the same location as it is now. During her years of running the schools on Grace Street or over on Franklin or finally St. Catherine's, when she started this school, it was called Virginia Randolph Ellett School. But 3 years later, it was purchased by the Episcopal Diocese of Virginia and became St. Catherine's at that time. But I was going to say, during that period of time, she was continuing her education. She took classes at Harvard and other universities up in New England. The irony is, she never received a college degree herself. Later on, the University of Richmond gave her a Phi Beta Kappa key in recognition of her, tremendous contribution to education and education of women in the Richmond area. And at the time of her death, she was recognized not only in Richmond or Virginia, but throughout the country, East Coast and New England, as a premier educator, really. Now, let's talk about another person in education, and this is Rosa Dixon Bowser. She was born in Alabama, was it 1855, and her family came up to Virginia. She was born into slavery, really, but her family came up to Virginia after the Civil War. And she also was able to attend that school that we've mentioned that later became Armstrong School. And she excelled in math and history and some other things. But after she finished her education there, she became a part of a program to train teachers. And so she became a teacher. Now, there's some question, the historians are not sure, she may have been the first African-American teacher licensed to teach in the city of Richmond. If she wasn't the first, she was 2 or 3 or something like that. And so here again, a lot of the effort and momentum after the Civil War, think of the times when you had the Civil War ending, the amendments to the Constitution that granted, that abolished slavery. And so you have people who formerly had been enslaved all of a sudden are eligible to be in the regular workforce. Now, part of being successful in the workforce, of course, depending on what you're going to do, has to do with how well you're trained. Whether you're trained for something like Dr. Jones or whoever, or Maggie Walker, whatever, or in a factory, whatever it is. So education on a number of levels was very important. And so it was very important that what Rosa Bowser was doing for education of people in that Jackson Ward area and around there. She also realized, and this is pretty savvy on her part, I think, she realized early on that teachers don't do as well if they just keep to themselves in their classroom and don't pay any attention to what the other teachers are doing down the hall. She thought, wouldn't it be a good idea for teachers to get together, share ideas, share strategies about how they teach and what works and what doesn't work? The Department of Education of the state does this all the time now. She helped establish they called it a reading circle. It was for the teachers. She was also involved in some of the early suffrage movement, which we'll talk about more, gaining the right of women to vote. That was a long, hard struggle. So here's that suffrage movement now. Lila Mead married Benjamin Valentine, who of the Valentine family, of course, and she also went, educated in the Richmond area. She became very interested in this whole idea that we've been talking about, that in this industrial age and a lot of social change, a lot of cultural change, economic change going on, and women did not have the right to vote. There were some early efforts. The Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 up in New York was trying to begin some of the efforts toward that. It was not only towards suffrage, it was toward the entire aspect of women's rights. You might say that's kind of an early beginning of women's rights movement. Big focus, though, on the right to vote. You can imagine how efforts by either housewives or educators or nurses or whoever it might be, how their effort to push for the right of women to vote, how that was met, the kind of resistance that it met from the men, from husbands or from top politicians or from businessmen. The effort, it was, at the time you would have thought it was insurmountable. But the people that were involved in this effort weren't going to let a little bit of hardship like that stop them. So Lila Mead Valentine helped establish the Equal Suffrage League. And it was a league that started here in Richmond to help push for the right of women to vote. And it started out small, but through her efforts and through the efforts of others that she was working with, it became in a few years, the organization had 119 chapters, I guess you'd call them, throughout the country. And they tried during the years of the First World War, before the war and on into it, 1912 up to 1916, 17, and so forth, they tried to get the state legislature, Virginia state legislature, to have the Constitution amended so that the Constitution of Virginia would grant women the right to vote. And of course, every time that who was in the General Assembly but men, they turned that down every time. Finally, through the efforts of all of the women involved in suffrage throughout the country, finally in 1919, of course, there was the 19th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which granted women the right to vote. Now, when an amendment like that is, established, it has to be ratified by 2/3 of the states. Virginia, it got ratified. Virginia did not come around to ratifying that amendment until 1952. Of course, women had been able to vote during that whole period of time, but it just wasn't one that was ratified by the Virginia legislature. Here's a little sad end to that story, though, and that is 1919, women granted the right to vote. Next election was going to be 1920. Lila Mead Valentine died a few months before the election. Did not get to cast that first vote that she was, so instrumental in being a part of. This is a picture of a rally by women's suffrage groups on the steps of the Virginia Capitol. In 1936, though, the General Assembly did put this relief bust sculpture type thing in the General Assembly. And there's, I think it's a copy of that that's the same one at the Valentine, isn't it? Isn't this same one outside the Valentine? I think that's the same. I think it's identical to the ones over at the Capitol, All right, let's go from suffrage and voting and so forth over into the field of art. Adele Goodman Clark, her passion was art and painting and illustration. She studied some in New York, came back to Richmond, and she and several others started the art, I think just had a simple name of Art Club of Richmond or something like that. And they were involved in helping train people who were interested in, improving their skills in the area of art. She taught some people such as Teresa Pollock, who we'll talk about in a few minutes. But not only did Ms. Clark get involved in the art scene, she also, as so many of these women, they had an area that was their specialty, let's say. But they were involved in a lot of other issues too. She was involved in some of this, voting push for women and that type of thing. And here's the way she would do it. She and a couple of others would go down on Gray Street, near where the department stores were. They would set up an easel, and they would start painting a scene, maybe a building along Gray Street in Richmond. Well, naturally, that would draw the passersby to stop, talk to them, what are they doing, and that kind of thing. And when the people stopped, Ms. Clark and the other artists would hand them some literature on women's suffrage, on the women's right to vote, that type of thing. An example of the resistance that movement was facing was they would always get heckled. Men would come by and they would, shout things to them, probably not always, very nice things to say. And one particular gentleman, said, "Why aren't you at home? Why don't you, let your husband take care of you?" And she said, I've been taking care of myself, almost my entire life. I teach, that kind of thing. She wasn't having any parts of that criticism. Here's a picture of her and several women who were involved. This was a well-known suffrage picture in the Richmond area of women who were involved in that effort. And something I forgot to mention about Lila Mead Valentine. You can imagine that the Valentine family would be well respected in the Richmond area and would be received well by the community. But once Lila Mead got involved in that women's suffrage effort, she was shunned by a lot of people. People would see her on the street that she had known all her life and would turn the other way or not speak to her. Teresa Pollock, she was someone who studied, I think I mentioned, with Adele Clark in that art club. She went up to New York, studied at the Art Students League in New York. She studied at Harvard, comes back to Richmond, and gets involved at old RPI. What's RPI stand for? Okay, and before it became part of VCU, you combine with the medical MCV to become VCU. She started, teaching some art classes there, then became a professor there, then established the full art department there, and it progressed and got better and better. Now here again, just like some of these other people we're talking about, who were always kind of pushing the limits of what was accepted at the time, she got a lot of criticism because she instituted the idea of having nude models sit for the artists who were, learning to paint the human body. But it would be an easy answer if I ask you the question now, based on the background, what is the #1 graduate art program of a public university in the United States of America? It's VCU's program. I think very well recognized. And her work is exhibited in a number of museums and areas throughout the country. She actually did this of Adele Clark. Pollock did that. Now, let's talk about Ellen Glasgow. If you're going down Main Street in Richmond, leaving the financial area, and just before you get to the Jefferson Hotel on the left is the sort of a Greek revival house that was the Glasgow house, still there. Her family was born outside of Richmond. She was born in 1880. They moved to Richmond. Her health was not that good when she was a young girl. Her father had a very good library, though, and Ellen Glasgow devoured literature. She read all the time, and she began writing stories when she was 6 or 7 years old. So she decided that she wanted to become a writer. She, over her life, she wrote some 20 novels. And early on in her career, she traveled up to New York City, to a publishing house up in New York City, took one of her manuscripts with her, and she wanted to see if this publishing house would consider publishing the manuscript for her novel. And the editor looked across the table to her and said, "Miss Glasgow, why don't you just go back home and have babies?" She went back home and wrote. And, he probably didn't live to see the day, but her writing was such that in the early 1940s, her novel, In This Our Life, was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Literature. Now, here's the thing about her writing, though. A lot of writing in the late 1800s, early 1900s, was writing that was trying to glorify a Richmond past that was no longer in existence. And Ellen Glasgow and other writers and other people during that time wanted instead not to have this nostalgic look, but to address the reality of how culture was changing, how the economy was changing, and how it was affecting people's lives. And she would portray that in the characters of her novels. she did not, a lot of times she was not well received in the Richmond community because she would make statements such as, talking about the kind of writing that the people of Richmond maybe wanted. She would make statements like, a lot of people in Richmond are illiterate. That'll win you friends. We've got a picture here. Let me see if I can get to it. James Batch Cabell, and this is her on the back right back here. This fellow is from Chicago. I'm trying to remember what his name is. But anyway, she was always involved in these literary circles. And James Branch Cabell was also a writer. The Cabell Library, of course, named after him. He was also a writer and wrote some fantasy type things, sometimes some strange works. They had kind of a love-hate relationship. Sometimes they would really admire the writing of the other, and sometimes they would just completely trash it. But in Richmond, very, big part of the literary scene, the writing scene, with Ellen Glasgow. She was involved somewhat in some of these women's movements, but more from a philosophical point of view than from an activist point of view. One thing that she was interested in, though, was animal rights, and she helped with the establishment of the Richmond SPCA. So, and I don't know whether this story is actually accurate or not, but some say that there was a story about she had traveled to Scotland, and she had purchased some little figurines of some dogs there in Scotland, and just had this interest in animals and so forth. And so I think she became president of their chapter in 1925 and was active in that organization until her death. She died in right at the end of World War II in 1945. Somebody who went to Virginia Randolph Ellett School that would later become the St. Catherine's was Winky, or Mary Wingfield Scott. And her passion was art and was architecture, that type of thing. She went through that program, of course, went to Bryn Mawr as part of that path, and then went to University of Chicago, and she studied art and art history. She comes back to Richmond, and of course, another change that was taking place with all these cultural changes that we've been talking about was a change in the landscape. A lot of people were moving, with advances in transportation and that type of thing. A lot of people were moving out of the inner city of Richmond to new suburbs, and then maybe commuting into Richmond to work. So there were a lot of structures in Richmond that were beginning to be torn down. And Mary Wingfield Scott became very interested in preserving that architecture, which had some special significance. Now, she wasn't one who was interested in just saving a building to save a building. She thought if it had architectural significance or historical significance and should be preserved, she was interested in that. She started one of the associations in Richmond that was the beginning of this preservation movement was the Association for the Preservation of Antiquities, formed in the late 1800s. I think it's called Preservation Virginia or something like that now. But anyway, she formed the William Byrd chapter of the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities in the 1930s. And the first house that the Byrd chapter acquired was the Craig House, which was a frame house at 19th and Grace, up at the bottom, down the hill from Church Hill. And it was slated for destruction. Second oldest residential dwelling in the city of Richmond. Does anybody know what the first is, the oldest? The Poe House is the oldest, but this will be the second. And so rather than being torn down, it was preserved. Now, interesting aside, and a connection to Poe, possible connection to Poe, Poe wrote a poem called To Helen. And there are some who say that there was some imagery of a woman at a window, the curtain there in the Craig House, and that formed part of the inspiration for his writing. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's just something that I had read one time. So that was the beginning. In this bird chapter also helped acquire, what they would do, they would acquire and restore and maintain homes and try to get them on a historical registry. Other homes up in Churchill around St. John's Church, some pre-Civil War homes in Oregon Hill that they acquired. But the gem, as far as I think she was concerned and most people were concerned, was Linden Row. Linden Row, I mentioned earlier, that's where Virginia Randolph Ellett moved her school in 1897 to the north side of Franklin between 1st and 2nd Street, if you remember that area. It used to have 10 of these adjoined Greek Revival with a portico on the front. Let me see if I've got a picture of it in front of it. Yeah, right here. I'm sorry. Used to be 10 of them. There are now 8. But I think at one time, I guess it was the Architectural Digest, National Architectural Magazine, said, Linden Row is probably the finest example of Greek Revival architecture in the country. So this was one that Mayor Wingfield Scott acquired through the Bird chapter of that Preservation Association. And at first, of course, it was used early on for some starving artists. So space was rented out. And actually that area between Grace and Main and 1st and 2nd, that kind of block through there, kind of had a nickname of Richmond's Greenwich Village during that time. But later on, she wrote 2 books, Houses of Old Richmond and Old Richmond Neighborhoods. And they say that one time when she would take some of the photographs herself. She could be a little eccentric sometimes too. Somebody said one time they saw her climbing up one of the magnolia trees with a camera to get just the right angle for a photograph of part of Linden Row there. I think this was a groundskeeper, I think it was, for Linden Row at one time. And he said one morning he looked out, and she's out there in a mink coat and tennis shoes sweeping leaves away. She also had, and you can imagine the fights that she would have with City Hall over the proposed destruction of some of the, architectural gems in Richmond that she thought were worth saving. And her comment to them, just like Ellen Glasgow could kind of upset some people sometimes, she said that a lot of the people down there at City Hall just didn't have any taste based on what they wanted to get rid of, Now, let's talk about Grace Arentz. You remember Louis Ginter, who, after the Civil War, he'd been up in New York during the Civil War, and he had like a banking business up there, but then there was a recession after the Civil War. The banking business failed. He comes back to Richmond, and he helps establish the company that later became American Tobacco, acquired a huge fortune. He didn't marry. I don't know if it was his closest relative, but Grace Arentz was his niece. And she was educated up in New York area, but came to Richmond and helped him out on a number of things. He left her this huge fortune. And there were a number of things that she decided to do with that. She became known as the Angel of Oregon Hill. She established the St. Andrew's School there, the church, a library there, a playground. Now get this, and they were talking about these working conditions. A playground for working children. So when these children who had been, before we had any child labor laws, who would get off work and come home and go to a playground. That little nugget right there tells you a lot about just some of the issues and problems that we're facing. But she did that. Also, before Louis Ginter died, he had a dream of some suburbs up north of Richmond, Ginter Park area and that type of thing. And in the late 1800s, bicycling was very, very popular. And he started the Lakeside Wheel Club, I think it was called, and acquired some property that's now on a well-known location that we'll talk about in a minute. He died, though, before a lot of the construction of some of that Gunner Park property was able to go on. And she took over after his death, and so the development continued. The house where the Lakeside Wheel Club was used as a hospital for a while, but then after there was no longer a need for the hospital, she moved in to that property, and she stayed there during her life. Now, she called it Bloemendaal to kind of harken back to her Dutch ancestry, and Bloemendaal meant Valley of Flowers. Okay, that's your clue. What did this property become? Okay, the Botanical Gardens. So she was someone who she could have, used her vast inheritance for any number of reasons, but she was actually always looking for someone else that she could help out with it that way. Okay, we're going to kind of finish up with a few ladies who were of more recent era and who, just like in the ones we've been talking about, have a variety of backgrounds. Eleanor Parker Shepard came to Richmond, I think, from Georgia. And naturally, when she had young children in school, like so many parents would get involved with the school, and she became involved with the PTA, and she became president of the PTA, and her organizational skills and leadership skills were recognized. She was pushed to run for public office. So she ran for and was elected to a seat on city council. And her leadership abilities were such on city council that in 1962 she became the first female mayor of an incorporated city, I think in the country. And that was a very difficult time during which she was mayor. A lot was going on. And, it was after, the integration of public schools was going on, and a lot of turmoil, as you know, during the 60s was going on. So a very difficult time. After city council and mayorship, she was elected to a position in the Virginia House of Delegates. And she was a co-sponsor of the bill that was going to combine Old Medical College of Virginia and Richmond Professional Institute to become Virginia Commonwealth University. So again, I think that may be in the Valentine. Do you recall whether that picture, that portrait is there? I've forgotten whether it is or not. I think that was from the time when she was mayor. One that we don't recognize as easily, Mari Hasegawa. Her family came over from Japan before World War II. She was educated at the University of California, Berkeley, home economics actually. But her family was then interred in some of those internment camps during World War II. Hers was in Utah. She started, some cooking there and just helping people there. After the war, she ended up in Richmond, and she ended up with the Department of Aging in Richmond, and a very soft-spoken but powerful-speaking woman on matters of social justice. And her feeling was that, social justice is the key ingredient to world peace, and became involved in, I think it was called the Women's International Association for Peace and Freedom, something like that. And she spoke not only around the country, but around the world. She was with a delegation that went to Vietnam, during the Vietnam War era, and received an International Peace Award. But she had a long stay, right here in the city of Richmond. I was trying to come up with the name of it, and it's written right there, huh? You could have told me what it was. Let's go into the field of law. Elizabeth Birmingham Lacey, she was in the Attorney General's office down in Texas, but I guess maybe after her marriage or whatever, came to Richmond and was working in the Attorney General's office in Richmond. And her skills there were such that she was recognized to have a keen legal mind, and was appointed first female judge of the Virginia State Corporation Commission that would hear all of these cases involving rate structure and all that kind of thing. And then in 1988, Governor Baliles appointed her first female justice of the Virginia Supreme Court. And then she was reappointed. That's a 12-year term. She was reappointed after that. She was one, you can imagine the language that would be included in a lot of these legal briefs and so forth. And if a lawyer tried to file a brief with all this gobbledygook legalese, she would say, write it in simple English. Just give me a plain, straightforward, well thought out legal argument. But the other thing she said was, when somebody asked her one time about her being a female, in this case, first female justice of the Supreme Court of Virginia, she said, if young girls are able to see someone such as myself in a position like this, then if seeing that gives that young girl inspiration or motivation or desire to do something further, then she said it was worth it. Anna Inez King, born in Columbia, and she formed the Santander Jazz Association down in Columbia and studied dance down there, came to Richmond and studied some dance at VCU, and then became a professor at VCU. And her work was so well recognized that she received the Teresa Pollock Award of Excellence for her work in that regard. She established the Latin Ballet of Virginia. And an interesting aspect of that is, of her teaching of dance, was she liked to use it for several purposes. One, to educate people on the Latin culture when they might not otherwise have as much knowledge about the Latin culture. And also, she tried to help use dance as a way to teach language too, to someone learning to speak Spanish or learning to speak English or whatever. So very well recognized dancer. So let's see, it's 7:50. We've covered a lot of women from a lot of different walks of life who have done a lot of different things. But I think, as we talked earlier, you can see the thread that goes throughout of how so often they wanted to do something beyond themselves, not for themselves, but what can I do for somebody else? And, without them, suppose you took that group of people out of the history of Richmond. Richmond would be the worse for it, wouldn't it? Would have lost some things. As part of the idea of recognizing the efforts of women, just several years ago, the Virginia Women's Monument, Voices from the Garden, on Capitol grounds there, and there are 12 little bronze statues of some women, but then names of hundreds. One of the reasons that it was felt necessary to do that is think back to early education that you had, and how often women were omitted from the history books when contributions were very extensive. I mean, I can remember reading, Virginia history books in the 4th grade, no mention of so many of these ladies from, earlier eras that we have talked about. So, that's part 2. I'm going to come back in 50 years and we'll do part 3. And you're going to have to if you're not here, I'm going to be upset. But what I want to do now is, some of the ladies we talked about, you may have heard some stories about them, knew them, whatever. Anybody have any questions? I think we've got a mic if you do. Or comments. Somebody gave you some chocolate tomatoes today. If you want to throw some chocolate tomatoes at me, you can do that. Any questions? Here we go.
Can you hold on?
She'll get to you here.
I need a microphone.
Yeah.
Is Phyllis Galante on your list of women?
That's going to be on that monument. Now, here's the thing. Thank you for bringing that up, because when we present this, without all the time, and I forgot to mention too, there are so many ones that we did not mention, and that that's a prime example of one that could be included. This program will change over time, and we might add somebody, next month that we didn't have this time, but that's not one that's been included so far. Who's that?
They're saying it should be, that she should be included.
Oh, I agree. I think so too. I want to pass that along to the education department at the Valentine. Somebody mentioned another one just a few weeks ago, another educator that should be included and could very easily be included. Anybody? That's a good way maybe to address it. Who else did we not talk about? I mean, you might think, remember past years of Mary Sue Terry, Attorney General's office, that kind of thing. A number of people. Anybody else?
Well, if there are no other questions for you, thank you so much for that very educational program.
Thank you. Good to see you, and hope to see you soon.